Well, in my reading as of late, I have found myself reading these books of nautical adventures. And perhaps it's better to call them nautical mishaps because almost all of the books that I read end in near disaster and sometimes total disaster. Which I suppose there's kind of a confirmation bias to this because if nothing went wrong, there would be no book to write, you know? It's like they set sail, did what they went to do, came back, end of story. Boring book, like you wouldn't read it, doesn't sell. So all of the books I read about nautical things, something goes horribly wrong. And I've read these books, and there's this consistent theme where a ship, right? The first one I read was about a ship called the Endurance, and it got surrounded by ice and crumpled like a soda can and sunk to the bottom of the ocean. I read another one called In the Heart of the Sea about the whale ship Essex, and it literally got rammed by a 150-foot whale and sunk to the bottom of the ocean. And then I heard about another story of the HMS Bounty that sailed from England to Tahiti. And the guys liked it in Tahiti so much that when they tried to sail back, they mutinied the captain and sent 18 of his men adrift at sea. Now, all three of these stories ended up in the same way. They went out on quite a safe, quite a large vessel, and they ended up out in the open ocean in a very small boat, perpetually threatened by waves that were many times taller than them, storms that threatened to capsize them, and dwindling supplies that left them on the brink of death. And the reason this morning that I chose to go to Psalm 61 is because I believe that there is a perhaps unusually high percentage of people in this congregation at this time in the life of our church family whose lives feel a little bit like that. Whose lives feel like they have lost their place of security and stability, and they are adrift at sea facing danger and death. And I'm not even saying that as like a general broad brush or a blanket. I'm saying it because of the people that I have prayed with and wept with and spent time with who right now in our church have received terminal cancer diagnosis, who are on hospice care in their home just waiting to meet the Lord, whose children have completely broken relationship with them and walked away from the Lord, who have agonized over prayers that they have prayed for years and yet gone unanswered, who have lost jobs and are facing fear and suicidal ideation and uncertainty and anxiety about the future. All of this and more is in our church family right at this very moment. Many of us find ourselves in a situation that is very similar to the situation in which David found himself when he penned Psalm 61. You see, when David wrote Psalm 61, it was in a situation that caused him to desperately cry out to the Lord for refuge and for rescue. And what David experienced through the course of Psalm 61, I believe is what we need to experience in our time of trouble. Because as we study this morning, what we'll see is that David begins this inspired song by a desperate plea to God to hear his prayers and listen to him and respond to him. And just a few verses later, he ends the psalm with resolute trust and confidence and commitment to walk with God no matter his circumstances. And so whatever David experienced in between the beginning of this psalm and the end of this psalm is something that you and I desperately need to experience in our time of trouble. And so if you would with me, whether you are in a time of trouble right now, and I know it is some of you, or you have come out of a time of trouble, or you are heading into a time of trouble, if you would focus with me on these verses in God's word, and let's see what David experienced that brought him to a place of resolute commitment and confidence. Psalm 61 says this: "To the choir master with stringed instruments of David, hear my cry, O God, listen to my prayer. From the end of the earth I call to you when my heart is faint. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I. for you have been my refuge, a strong tower against the enemy. Let me dwell in your tent forever. Let me take refuge under the shelter of your wings. For you, O God, have heard my vows. You have given me the heritage of those who fear your name. Prolong the life of the king. May his years endure to all generations. May he be enthroned forever before God. Appoint steadfast love and faithfulness to watch over him. So will I ever sing praises to your name as I perform my vows day after day. Here's the big idea. In times of trouble, God's people experience peace in God's presence. In times of trouble, in times of chaos and difficulty and suffering and pain, God's people, those who belong to him and know him and walk with him, they experience peace not primarily because God takes their trouble away, but because he is with them in the midst of the trouble. And this is what I find so stunning about this psalm, is that in the course of these 8 verses, most assuredly, David's situation did not change. But his perspective changed because he spent time in the presence of God. And the same thing can be true for you and for me. Even if God, in his sovereign wisdom, chooses to leave you in the troubling situation in which you find yourself, you can have a soul that is settled with supernatural peace when you are in the presence of God. That's what happened to David. He cried out to God, found himself in the presence of God, and experienced the peace of God. And that is what you and I need more than anything else in the world. And perhaps it is even why God has led you into the trial and the trouble in which you find yourself. Because I don't know if you're like me, but so often when the circumstances of my life are all squared away and everything's fine and I feel great, I am forgetful of the fact that what I need most is God. What I need most is him. I don't even need my circumstances to be all perfect and situated. I need God in my life. I need to be mindful of him and dependent on him and obedient to him. And it is often the times of trial and trouble in our lives that remind us of that which is most important. And so it was here for David. His trial drove him to the presence of God where he experienced peace. And it can be true for you and for me as well. And so let's walk through this text and let's ask this question. How can I have peace in my time of trouble? If you're there right now, how can you have peace when you find yourself in the midst of trouble? And here is how. I'm going to show you 3 paths to peace in your time of trouble. Here's the first one. I have peace when, number 1, my unstable circumstances lead me to his unchanging character. My unstable circumstances lead me to his unchanging character. Here's I think, one of the core reasons that we do not experience peace in times of trouble. Because we fall prey to the very human tendency to view God through the lens of our circumstances. You and I do this all the time. When things go wrong, when things are bad, when things are hard, we are so liable to look at God and to judge his character based on what I'm experiencing. And that is never a legitimate way to decide or to understand who God is. You must understand who God is because of how he has revealed himself, and then you must view your circumstances through what God says is true. But far too often we do it in reverse. We allow the shifting tides of our lives to inform the way that we think about and interact with God. But David would instruct us by example to do the opposite. Notice here, he begins, he says, "Hear my cry, O God, listen to my prayer." Make no mistake, this is not a emotionless, stoic petition to God. Like, hey, God, some things are going wrong in my life, and I'd like to address them with you. If we could talk for a moment. That's not what's going on here. In fact, the word cry there is like an agonized scream. He's yelling out for God in the midst of his trouble because he is so burdened by what's going on in his life. He's yelling out to him and he's saying, God, would you just listen to me? Can you hear my prayer and respond to me? I need you, God. The situation he's in, he describes in two ways. He describes it geographically, though I think it's mostly metaphorical, and he describes it emotionally. You notice there, he says, from the ends of the earth, I call to you. He pictures himself as so far removed from God and the place of his presence and his favor that he's at the ends of the earth. He's removed from where God is and where he's working and where he's active. But he's about to learn the truth of Psalm 139, that there is nowhere that he can flee from the presence of God. And what he does here actually teaches us. Because when he says he's at the ends of the earth, guess what he's still doing? He's calling out to God. He's calling out to God no matter where he is, or secondly, no matter how he feels. Do you see this? He says, when my heart is faint. The KJV famously translated that phrase, when my heart is overwhelmed. And that is a perfect picture of the situation that David is in right here. Whatever situation's going on in his life, we don't really know exactly what situation it is, but a lot of scholars believe it was when his son Absalom rebelled against him and his very own flesh and blood tried to take his life and his throne. You think you got problems? His son was trying to murder him, and he was displaced from the place of God's presence and promise and favor, and he says, my heart is overwhelmed, which literally means that the gas tank of his courage and his strength and his hope was on E. He had nothing left in the tank, and he was about to fall over and give up. He was overwhelmed, in over his head. But what I love about this moment is when he knows that he is far away from God and he has no more strength left. What does he do? He cries out to God. And he says this, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. Lead me to the rock. Now, notice that he doesn't say, lead me to a rock. He says, lead me to, in grammar, this is a definite article, lead me to the rock. You're like, why does that matter? Well, it's definitive proof that he's talking about God, because the Psalms 22 separate times refer to God as the rock of refuge for God's people. The picture you're supposed to imagine here is like the nautical image that I brought up at the beginning, when there is a storm-tossed sea that is chaotic and deadly and dangerous. And what he's saying is, I need to be taken out of this danger and chaos, and my feet need to be planted on the solid ground of God's unchanging character. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I. And this is what he's asking for. He's asking for stability. He's asking for sureness. He's asking for peace in the midst of what he's going through. And he knows that God himself is the place to find it. This made me think of when I was in PE class as a kid. Do you remember when you were like a little kid and they were trying to teach you how to stretch? And they taught you how to do like the one-legged quadricep stretch like this. But every little kid in the world has horrible balance. They wobble and they fall over. And so if you remember that your PE teacher, when you were a little kid and they were teaching you to stretch, they would tell you when you go up on one leg and everything is unstable, they would say, fix your eyes on something that isn't moving and you will find your balance. And I think that's exactly the picture of what's going on here. When our lives feel unstable and we feel like we're about to fall over, what we need to do is fix our eyes on something that isn't moving. And so If you want peace in times of trouble, my plea to you, and by the example of David, I would exhort you today to lift your eyes off of the shifting circumstances around you. And in fact, allow those shifting circumstances to cause you to fix your gaze on the immovable, unchangeable faithfulness and dependability of the God that you serve. He never changes. The scriptures say that he is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so even if your life feels like shifting sand and there's nothing dependable in your life, there is one great, eternal, fixed reality upon which you can stand, and it is the character of God. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I. Lead me to God where I can fix my gaze and I can know that no matter what is transpiring in my situation right now, my God is sovereign and he is loving and he is holy and he is faithful and he is good. And I can trust in him. And as I fix the eyes of my heart on the unchanging character of my God, I can have a settled soul. I can have peace in the trouble because I'm in the presence of a God who never changes, who is always the same and has revealed himself to me. This is the first way David models for us how we can have peace in the trouble, is we allow our unstable and shifting circumstances to cause us to look to and depend on the unchanging and unchangeable character of our faithful God. He never moves. He is the rock. And so it is right for us to sing, "On Christ, the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. I will look no other place for my stability and my security except Jesus Christ and his unchanging character." If you want peace in the midst of trouble, run to the rock, fix your eyes upon him, and get your spiritual feet standing upon him. Here's the second path to peace. In times of trouble, God's people experience peace in his presence. Here's the second way that you can experience that. I have peace when, number two, my future confidence is built on his past faithfulness. What I hope about the future and what I expect about the future is based on what God has done in the past. This is how I can have peace in the time of trouble. Far too often, when we get ourselves in the midst of trouble, the reason that our peace is completely robbed is because we have a pessimistic and fearful view of what lies ahead for us. We think to ourselves, if this is the situation I'm in right now, then what's coming for me is going to be worse. And we live in fear and we live in anxiety and we live in uncertainty about the future. But what David models for us here is not that we would look to the future with doubt and anxiety, but that we would look to the past with faith so that it can give us courage for what lies ahead. And the reason I know he's doing that is because in verse 3, he switches to the past tense. He's just said, I'm calling out to you, lead me. And then he says this, for you have been my refuge. He doesn't say, be my refuge, though he is asking for that. He actually stops in this moment. Think about this. He's calling out to God. God, I need you. God, I'm in a desperate situation. God, please help me. And then he says, you have protected me. You've protected me. You have been my refuge. What is a refuge? It is a place of safety from danger. If you ever played a game of tag, it's home base where the person who's it can't get you. You know what I'm talking about? Like you run there and you arrive wherever the home base is and you're like, you can't touch me. That's a refuge. A place of safety from danger. And he says, not only have you been my refuge, you have been a strong tower against the enemy. This makes me think of Lord of the Rings, just me. But it makes me think of one of those giant stone towers. And the idea here is not only a place to which you can retreat to be safe, but a place to which you can retreat so that you can launch a counterattack on your enemy. Because it is a high place and a strong place where your vantage point allows you to attack the enemy, but them not to attack you. And David is saying, God, this is what you have been for me in the past. And then if you skip down to verse 5, he keeps going with the past tense about what God has done. He says, for you, O God, have heard my vows. You have given me the heritage of those who fear your name. This is so good because in the very beginning of this psalm, David said, God, please listen to me. And after like 5 seconds in God's presence, what does he say? God, you have listened to me. I've cried out to you in the past, and you were there, and you heard me, and you received my cry. You have heard my vows. And what have you done? You've given me the inheritance. That's that word, heritage. You've given me the inheritance of those who fear your name. The scriptures, especially the Old Testament, is full of blessings for those who fear and obey God, and curses for those who disobey and revile God. And David says, you've given me the blessing of knowing who you are and living in an appropriate reverence and fear of you, God. You've blessed me. Now, I think this is such a powerful reality for you and for me because we spend so much of our time in prayer, and appropriately so, crying out to God for our current situation. But my plea to you this morning, if you want to experience peace in the time of trouble, is to give at least as much time as you spend crying out to God about the trouble you want him to fix right now. Spend at least that much time remembering all of the trouble he got you out of before. Do not just get so focused on the situation that you are in right now and say, God, save me, God, help me, God, fix this, God, remove this, and be totally forgetful of the shower of blessings and protection and provision that have even gotten you to the place where you are able to pray that prayer. Don't forget that he has led you and cared about you and provided for you all the way to this point. Look back on what he has done, not just for you, but for all of his people for all time, and allow that to fill your heart with confidence for what he will do in the future. Do not be forgetful as you pray. I was thinking about that this week, and I was reminded of little kids. And just a little free parenting advice. I've been doing it for 4 years, so I'm something of an expert. Just free parenting advice. If you do something for a kid one time, be prepared to do that for the kid forever. They have a long memory, even when they are very small. And I learned this because like 6 months or a year ago, before Josiah was born, and it was just Titus and Jude, Rachel had like an event to go to in the evening, and we had a boys only club, which, you know, is fun, sometimes dangerous, always a good time. And we decided on this particular night that we were going to go and we were going to go to McDonald's, get some McFlurries, and then we were going to go to this park in my neighborhood that we call the Airplane Park, and we were going to eat ice cream on the jungle gym. And it was a great time. We did it, came home, mom came home, kids went to bed. It was awesome. But then, every single time my wife crossed the threshold of the door, Titus was like, you know what time it is, ice cream at the airplane park, let's go. It was like every single time. Because I had done it once in the past, he was like, let's load up, we're going to get McFlurries, and we're headed to the airplane park. Let's get this thing done, come on. What was he doing? He was building his expectation for the future based on what had happened in the past. And when we relate to God, we would do well to be a little more like that, where we build our expectation for what God is going to do in the future based on what he's done in the past. Because here's the fact of the matter. God has never once let you down or failed to be good on one of his promises. It has never happened. And your story will not be the first story in which it happens. God is faithful and dependable, and for all of his people, he gives them what they need when they need it, and he leads them where they ought to go. He is faithful to provide and to protect. And if you want to know how to have peace in the time of trouble, you should at least start there by reflecting on what God has done in the past to be filled with confidence for what God will do in the future. In verse 4, David prays for his future. And he asks for two things. He says, let me dwell in your tent forever. The tent is the tabernacle. This was the place of God's personal, manifest presence. And at this moment in his life, David is separated from the tabernacle, and he's calling out to God and saying, please bring me back to the place of your presence. And then he says, let me take refuge in the shelter or the shadow of your wings. That's a metaphor of a mother bird who in the face of danger would gather the little birds underneath her wings to protect them. And David is saying, he's calling out to God and saying, I need your presence and I need your protection. But I believe at that moment, he's doing it with a heart that is filled with confidence because he has already reflected on the fact that God has done it in the past and he will do it again. And if you want peace in the time of trouble, you can have it in the presence of God. And part of spending time in that presence will be reflecting on what God has done for you and for all of his people in the past so that you can be filled with confidence for the future. Here's the third pathway to peace in times of trouble. It's this: I have peace when my daily devotion is fueled by his eternal promise. My daily devotion is fueled by his eternal promise. Often when we are in times of trouble, we allow the circumstances and situation of this moment to decide how we will live this day, how we will act and how we will think and how we will feel and what we will do. What we do far too often is we look to the temporal and superficial and inevitably shifting circumstances that we're in to decide how we will live and act. And the Bible over and over and over again is trying to get us to zoom out and to broaden our time horizon to understand that the way we act on a day-by-day basis should not be primarily informed by how things are going on a day-to-day basis, but rather based on eternal realities that God has promised to us. This is why the Bible reminds you and exhorts you and commands you things like, do not set your mind on things that are on earth, but set your minds on things that are above, where Christ is. He is seated at the right hand of God, and he has accomplished all the work of salvation. And what he has done on your behalf, it bears eternal consequences, and it produces eternal fruit in your life. And so when you set your mind on the things that are above, it informs the way you take the very next step of your life. And that's, I believe, what David is doing here, is he's setting his mind on eternal realities, and then he is resolving how he will live on a day-to-day basis. And that is what we need in the time of trouble. We need to zoom out, and we need to be reminded that God is working on an eternal timeline on our behalf. And he's made promises to us that he will fulfill. David here shifts gears and he says, prolong the life of the king. You're like, wait, isn't David the king? Yes, he is. Is he praying for himself in the third person? Yes, he is. Should you pray for yourself in the third person? I don't know. God, just bless Nick today. Just pray that Nick would have a great day. I don't know. I guess if you're feeling it, just go for it. God knows what you mean. He prays here, prolong the life of the king. He's basically praying, long live the king. He's praying blessing upon the king, which you're like, that's kind of selfish. Yeah, but like you pray for yourself. He's praying for himself. You should pray for yourself. He's praying, prolong the life of the king. And then at the very end of verse 7, he says, Appoint steadfast love and faithfulness to watch over him. David is praying that God's blessing and protection would be upon his life as he leads God's people. It's not a purely selfish prayer, because David knows that if the king is doing well, the people are doing well. That's the story of the Old Testament over and over and over and over and over again. When the people who are in charge of God's people, when they get wayward and they start worshiping idols, the whole nation goes with them. But when the king is faithful to God and is obedient and worships according to God's command, the whole nation thrives. The whole nation is doing well. And so he's praying, God, bless me and protect me as I seek to serve your people. But then it becomes very clear that David is not just praying for himself, he's also praying beyond himself. Because he prays something like crazy here. Do you see it there? He prays in verse 6, may his years endure to all generations. And then this, may he be enthroned forever before God. That's a huge prayer. And David knew that no earthly king was going to live forever to satisfy the answer to that prayer. So why is he praying it? Why in the world would he ask God for something like this? I believe it is because in the time of his trouble, as he prays this prayer, he has the words of the prophet Nathan as the mouthpiece of God in 2 Samuel 7 ringing in his ears. Do you remember the story? David has been inaugurated as king. He's settled in Jerusalem. He's built himself a huge mansion, and he thinks to himself, God lives in a tent. I should probably rectify this situation. Like, I've got a massive mansion. He's in like some cloth rags. I need to build him a house. And through the prophet Nathan, God comes to David and he basically says, you're not going to build me a house. I'm going to build you a house. But the house is not going to be made of bricks and mortar and precious metals. The house is going to be a lineage that will come from your flesh, in which I will bring forth a king that will rule and reign forever before me. That's what he said. He said to King David, from your physical descendants will come a king whose rule and reign will know no end. He made an eternal promise to King David. And it's like he's remembering that promise as he prays. In 2 Samuel 7, the prophet Nathan said to David, I will raise up your offspring and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Now, there's no way that David could have seen with the clarity that we see who that descendant would be through the gift of God's progressive revelation, but he knew that he was coming, and he trusted God would have his descendants sit on his throne forever. And so he prayed this prayer that was fulfilled when the angel Gabriel told Mary, who was pregnant with Jesus, you will conceive and give birth to a child, and you shall call his name Jesus. And then the angel said, and the Lord God will give to him the throne of his father David, and of his kingdom there will be no end. So we know on the other side of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, and his ascension to the Father, and his being seated at the right hand of God, having accomplished all the work of salvation, that the ultimate fulfillment of this promise to David is found in our Lord Jesus Christ. David didn't even get to see what we see. David didn't even know what we know. David could never have fathomed that the King of eternity, the second person of the Trinity, Jesus Christ, would leave the comfort of heaven and take on human flesh so that he could come on a rescue mission for broken and lost sinners like you and me. And he would live a perfect record of obedience to God's law. He would go to the cross as a substitute where his blood would be shed to cover the sin of his people, and he would rise from the dead on the third day to give resurrection power and life to everyone who trusts in him by faith. That is the king that we serve, a king who was incarnate, a king who lived righteously, a king who suffered as a substitute, and a king who conquered death to fulfill the eternal promise of salvation for all of those who would run to him by faith. That is the eternal promise that we have experienced, that David prayed for. It is King Jesus in all of his fullness. And even though David didn't have the full picture, look at how he responds. It's the same way that we should respond. Verse 8, this is so powerful. Remember, he began this psalm with a desperate plea. And look at how he finishes. He says, "So will I ever sing praises to your name as I perform my vows day after day." This is so good. David resolves that in the midst of the chaos and the suffering, what will come out of his mouth will not be grumbling, it will not be complaining, it will not be fear, it will not be doubt and distrust of his God. It will be worship and honor through song. He says, "I will ever sing praises to your name. While I'm in the midst of the trouble, I will praise you. But not only will I be singing, and I'll be singing forever," he says, "as I perform my vow day by day." This right here is what you and I need in our time of trouble. We need to know that the way we live on a daily basis should be primarily informed by the eternal promise of God that is yes and amen in Jesus Christ. When we find ourselves in the chaos, because we have a God who has committed himself to us and who loves us and is faithful and will watch over us, we can say, "God, I will worship you and I will get to work doing what you have commanded me to do, no matter what my circumstances are." This does not mean that you have to pretend like everything is okay. Christians are not the ones who put on a fake plastic smile and just act like everything is all right when it's not. Christians are the ones who can face danger and difficulty and death, and who can weep, but who can worship while they weep. That's who Christians are, because they live their lives not based on their shifting circumstances, but based on his eternal promises. And so as the Christians of history have done, they can march to the cathedral, they can march to the Colosseum in to be executed, and they can do it while they're singing. They can face cancer and death and brokenness, and they can do it with joy indestructible in their hearts because they know who their God is. And so if we need trouble, if we need peace in the time of trouble, we need to build our daily devotion on the eternal promises of God. I was thinking a bunch just yesterday, as I'm sure many of you were, of the death of Tim Keller, a faithful pastor, preacher of the gospel, a minister who worked in New York City for many, many years, and who for the last 3 years or so suffered from pancreatic cancer, and just in the last few hours lost that battle. His physical body failed, and he went to be with the Lord Jesus. But what I was so inspired by and thankful for is that Tim Keller was faithful to the end. In a world where that feels increasingly less common, I found myself so moved by the example of somebody who loved his Lord and loved his wife until he breathed his last breath. And just a few months ago, in an interview with stage 4 pancreatic cancer in his body and leading him to a certain demise, he was asked, "What would you say to a Christian who is afraid of the future?" What would you say to a Christian who is afraid of the future? And this is what he said. He said, "I would say, if Jesus Christ was actually raised from the dead, if he really got up and walked out of the grave and was seen by hundreds and talked to them, if he really was raised from the dead, then everything is going to be all right. Whatever you're worried about right now, whatever you're afraid of, whatever you're going through, everything is actually going to be okay." You got to remember, we're not just talking about a resurrected people, we're talking about a resurrected world. Christianity says it's not just our bodies resurrected, but the entire material world will be cleansed from all evil and suffering and sin. If Jesus Christ was really raised from the dead, then the whole world, in a sense, is going to be resurrected and everything is going to be okay. Everything. That's what he said. And I was moved by two things. Number one, I was moved that in the face of certain and impending death, that he maintained that kind of hopeful perspective, and he worshiped God and worked for God until the very day he died. He did what David said in verse 8, so I will ever sing praises to your name as I perform my vow day by day. And the second thing that moved me about this is that immediately on the heels of saying that, right? Because you might read that and think, well, that's nice for him. He's like a pastor and he's got it all together and he's got all the theological answers. Everything seems fine for him, even in the midst of his suffering. Literally, the next words out of his mouth were this. After saying everything's going to be okay if Jesus is alive, he said, but Kathy and I, and that was his wife, but Kathy and I, we cried a lot last night. Sometimes the reality of the shortness of what we have left here overwhelms us, and we were weeping together. But you can say, Jesus Christ was raised from the dead, so it's going to be okay, and you can wipe your tears, but you don't stop crying. And I just thought that was such a helpful picture of what's illustrated in this text, that in the time of trouble, whether it's cancer, whether it's a lost job, whether it's a lost loved one, whether it's grief or pain or inner turmoil or anxiety, no matter what it is you face, if you are willing to build your life upon the unchanging character and the constant faithfulness and the eternal promise of your good God, you can have an unshakable peace in the midst of the trouble. David's circumstance from the beginning of the song to the end of the song did not change, but David changed. David trusted God because he found himself in his presence and he found peace there.